Hey guys, tonight we explore a question that sounds surprisingly modern. Could people in the Middle Ages have had autism? So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand why medieval people probably included autistic individuals, we first need to forget almost everything modern society associates with diagnosis. Imagine waking up in a small English village around the year 1300. There are no psychologists, no neurologists, no therapists, and certainly no online quizzes asking whether your habit of organising spoons by size means something profound. If a child behaves differently from others, nobody reaches for a medical textbook. Most villages possess exactly 0 medical textbooks, and the local healer is currently busy trying to determine whether onions can cure 3 completely unrelated illnesses. Instead, people ask different questions. Is the child blessed? Is the child unusual? Is the child destined for great things? Has God given them a special purpose? Or, depending on who is doing the talking, has a fairy stolen the real child and replaced them with another? That last explanation sounds absurd today, but it made perfect sense to many medieval people. Remember, this was an age when comets could be warnings from heaven, bad weather might signal divine displeasure, and a chicken behaving strangely could probably start a village rumour that lasted 6 months. The important thing to remember is that autism did not suddenly appear in the 20th century when doctors began describing it. Human beings have remained remarkably similar for thousands of years. The medieval world contained the same variety of minds that exist today. Some children were loud and sociable, some were quiet and withdrawn, some enjoyed festivals, crowded markets, and endless conversations. Others would probably have preferred everyone stop talking for 5 minutes, or forever. Some people developed intense interests that consumed enormous portions of their lives. One person might memorize every local family lineage. Another might spend years studying herbs. A monk might devote decades to copying manuscripts with microscopic precision. A scholar might become fascinated by a theological question so specific that even other scholars wished he would please discuss literally anything else. Medieval records are filled with people who stood out from their communities. Chroniclers wrote about individuals who avoided social interaction, preferred solitude, spoke very little, disliked certain environments, or became extraordinarily focused on particular subjects. Of course, none of this allows us to diagnose anyone. Historians cannot travel back in time, conduct assessments, and return with neatly completed paperwork. If they could, they would probably spend most of their time settling arguments at academic conferences. What we do have are descriptions, lots of descriptions. And when those descriptions are viewed through a modern lens, some begin to sound surprisingly familiar. The challenge is that medieval writers lacked the vocabulary we possess today. They could observe behaviour, but they could not categorize it using modern medical language. Instead, they described what they saw: the unusually quiet child, the obsessive scholar, the solitary monk, the craftsman who seemed happiest repeating the same task thousands of times. As we move deeper into the Middle Ages, we'll discover that these people appear far more often than you might expect. Hidden among kings, peasants, monks, merchants, and craftsmen are countless individuals whose lives suggest that neurological diversity is not a modern phenomenon at all. It may simply be one of the oldest human stories ever told. If you were an autistic child growing up in a medieval village, nobody would know it, not because your behaviour would go unnoticed. Quite the opposite. Medieval communities were small, close-knit places where everyone knew everyone else's business. If you sneezed unusually, there was a reasonable chance 3 neighbours would discuss it before sunset. Privacy was not a medieval strength. Most villages contained only a few hundred people at most. Families lived close together, worked together, worshipped together, and often spent their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. In such an environment, differences stood out quickly. A child who preferred solitude would be noticed. A child who spoke less than others would be noticed. A child who became intensely interested in a particular subject would definitely be noticed, especially if that subject happened to be something unusual. Imagine a boy who spends every spare moment watching birds instead of playing games with other children. He learns their migration patterns, nesting habits, and feeding behaviors. Years pass, and he still finds birds more interesting than most conversations. Today, some parents might wonder whether their child is neurodivergent. In the Middle Ages, people would probably conclude that he was simply the bird boy. And honestly, medieval nicknames were often far less flattering. Likewise, imagine a girl fascinated by weaving patterns. While other children run through fields chasing each other, she spends hours studying cloth, counting threads, and memorizing designs. Adults might see her as unusually gifted, unusually strange, or both simultaneously. The Middle Ages were surprisingly comfortable with that contradiction. A person could be admired and considered odd at exactly the same time. Many medieval children never attended school, which meant they were not constantly compared against standardized expectations. There were no report cards, no developmental checklists, and no teachers writing notes home about classroom participation. This could sometimes be an advantage. A child who struggled socially but excelled at practical skills might simply be directed toward an occupation that suited them. Medieval society cared far more about whether you could contribute than whether you fit neatly into a behavioral category. Of course, this was not always kind. Children who seemed different could face teasing, exclusion, or suspicion. Human beings have unfortunately remained remarkably consistent in their ability to notice anyone who does not perfectly match the group. Some things never change. Yet medieval communities could also be surprisingly accepting when someone's differences came with useful talents. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval life. A world where unusual minds sometimes found unexpected places to thrive. For a medieval person, religion was not something you did once a week. Religion was the framework through which almost everything was understood. The seasons, illnesses, wars, harvests, dreams, strange behavior, and unexpected events all fit into a universe governed by God. If someone acted differently from everyone else, the first explanation was rarely medical. It was spiritual. This created a fascinating situation for people who might today be recognized as autistic. Imagine a young man who dislikes crowded gatherings. He avoids village festivals, struggles with small talk, and prefers spending hours alone reading scripture or contemplating religious questions. In a modern setting, some people might see social difficulties. In the Middle Ages, others might see holiness. After all, many respected saints were not exactly known for their sparkling conversational skills. Throughout medieval Europe, stories circulated about holy men and women who preferred solitude, spoke very little, and devoted themselves obsessively to prayer. Some withdrew from society almost entirely. Others spent years focusing on a single spiritual pursuit with remarkable intensity. To medieval observers, such behavior could appear admirable rather than unusual. A monk who spent 10 hours a day studying sacred texts was disciplined. A saint who isolated himself in the wilderness was devoted. A hermit who avoided social gatherings was spiritually focused. Nobody was asking whether these individuals experienced social interactions differently. They were asking whether God had chosen them for a special purpose. Of course, not every difference received such positive interpretations. The medieval world could be generous one moment and deeply suspicious the next. If a person's unusual behavior fit accepted religious expectations, they might be praised. If it did not, people became nervous. A woman who spent hours speaking about visions might be regarded as blessed or dangerous. Sometimes the difference between those two judgments depended entirely on who happened to be listening. Medieval society had a remarkable talent for reaching completely opposite conclusions using the same evidence. This uncertainty meant that people who behaved differently often lived in a complicated social space. They might be respected by some neighbours and viewed with concern by others. Yet, Religion also provided something modern observers sometimes overlook. It gave unusual individuals a role. A person who seemed different could become a monk, a nun, a hermit, a scholar, or a religious devotee. Their intense focus, preference for routine, and comfort with solitude could actually fit certain religious lifestyles remarkably well. And nowhere was this more obvious than inside the monasteries of medieval Europe, where some men spent entire lifetimes pursuing a single passion with a level of concentration that would leave most modern office workers exhausted before lunchtime. For most medieval children, life was centered around one institution above all others: the family. Not school, not government, not social services, certainly not a team of specialists holding meetings about developmental milestones. The family was responsible for nearly everything: food, shelter, education, discipline, work training, and survival all happened under the same roof, assuming your roof wasn't currently leaking, which in medieval Europe was often an optimistic assumption. This meant that a child who behaved differently was usually understood first and foremost by their relatives. Parents quickly learned which children enjoyed company and which preferred solitude. They learned which children followed routines with almost military precision, and which ones seemed incapable of finding their shoes 2 days in a row. Some children spoke constantly, others barely spoke at all. Most families adapted as best they could. Contrary to popular stereotypes, medieval parents generally cared deeply about their children. Life was harsh, but affection was not absent. Surviving letters, household records, and personal accounts reveal parents worrying, grieving, teaching, encouraging, and sometimes becoming utterly confused by their offspring. In other words, they were parents. Imagine a boy who becomes distressed whenever his daily routine changes. He wants meals at predictable times. He performs chores in the same order every day. He dislikes unexpected visitors. When travellers arrive without warning, everyone else is excited to hear news from distant lands. The boy is mainly annoyed because somebody is sitting in his usual spot. His family might never understand exactly why he reacts this way, but they would notice. Over time, they would often make adjustments. Many medieval households were practical rather than theoretical. They cared less about explaining behaviour and more about managing it. If something worked, they kept doing it. If allowing a child to complete chores in a certain order prevented arguments, that became the routine. No lengthy debate required. Meanwhile, children with intense interests could sometimes become valuable family assets. A child fascinated by animals might become skilled with livestock. A child obsessed with counting and record-keeping might prove useful for managing accounts. A child who spent hours examining tools could eventually become a capable craftsman. The family often became the bridge between unusual traits and productive adulthood. Of course, not every family was patient or understanding. Some children undoubtedly faced criticism, punishment, or ridicule for behaviours nobody understood. But many others found something surprisingly important: acceptance. Not because people understood neurological differences, but because families often learned an eternal truth that transcends every century. When you love someone long enough, their peculiarities stop being peculiar. They simply become part of who that person is. And in medieval Europe, some of those children eventually grew into adults whose extraordinary focus would make them indispensable members of their communities. One of the biggest differences between the medieval world and the modern one was that intense interests were often not seen as hobbies. They were jobs. Today, if someone spends 8 hours researching the history of door hinges, their friends may have questions. In the Middle Ages, there was a decent chance that person eventually became the village blacksmith and made a respectable living from their unusual enthusiasm. This mattered because medieval society was built around specialization. Every community depended on people mastering highly specific skills. There were millers, masons, carpenters, scribes, weavers, armourers, bell makers, parchment makers, and countless other trades that required patience and repetition. Lots and lots of repetition. The romantic image of medieval life often involves adventure and excitement. But the reality was that many jobs consisted of performing the same task thousands of times. A stonemason might spend years carving nearly identical blocks. A blacksmith could make endless nails. A weaver might repeat the same movements hour after hour. A scribe could spend entire days copying words onto parchment. For many people, this was exhausting. For others, it may have been deeply satisfying. Imagine a young apprentice fascinated by patterns. While his friends dream of tournaments and heroic adventures, he becomes captivated by the geometry of cathedral construction. He studies arches, measurements, and stonework with relentless dedication. Years later, he might become a master builder. The villagers see expertise. Modern observers might also recognize something else, an extraordinary level of focus. Medieval records frequently mention individuals who became known for a single skill. Entire reputations were built upon mastery of one narrow area of knowledge. Some craftsmen could identify dozens of wood types by touch alone. Some scribes memorized enormous sections of religious texts. Some metalworkers spent decades perfecting techniques that outsiders barely noticed. These people were often respected precisely because of their intense interests. In fact, medieval society sometimes rewarded behavior that modern schools or workplaces might find unusual. A person who became completely absorbed in one subject could gain status, wealth, or influence if that subject happened to be useful. Of course, there were limits. If your obsession involved counting raindrops or following chickens around the village while taking notes, your career options remained somewhat restricted. Still, the broader pattern is clear. The Middle Ages created spaces where intense focus could become valuable rather than problematic. And nowhere was this more obvious than inside the monasteries, where some individuals devoted entire lifetimes to a single subject with a level of concentration that bordered on the astonishing. If there was one place in medieval Europe where an intensely focused person could thrive, it was a monastery. To modern eyes, monasteries can seem quiet, peaceful, and perhaps a little repetitive. To many medieval monks, that was not a drawback. That was the entire point. A monastery offered something increasingly rare in the chaotic medieval world: routine. The day followed a schedule. Prayers occurred at fixed hours. Meals happened at fixed times. Work had clearly defined expectations. The bells rang according to a predictable pattern. Life was structured, ordered, and remarkably consistent. For some people, this was comforting. For others, it was heaven with slightly fewer cushions. A medieval monk might wake before dawn, attend prayers, study scripture, copy manuscripts, perform assigned duties, and repeat the process day after day, year after year. To an outsider, such a life could seem monotonous. To someone who enjoyed routine and deep concentration, it could be incredibly satisfying. Monasteries were also centres of learning. Books were precious and rare, so monks often spent years studying the same texts repeatedly. Many developed astonishing memories. Some could recite enormous portions of scripture from memory. Others mastered complex theological arguments that filled entire volumes. A few became experts in subjects so specialized that even their fellow monks struggled to understand why anyone cared. History is full of scholars who spent decades arguing over details that would make modern people quietly close the book and walk away. One medieval debate concerned the exact nature of angels. Another involved intricate questions about divine knowledge and free will. These discussions could continue for years, and remarkably, participants enjoyed them. Many monks displayed a level of focus that modern observers would immediately recognize as unusual. They dedicated entire lifetimes to cataloguing information, preserving texts, and perfecting tiny details that most people overlooked. Consider the manuscript copyists. A single book could require months or even years to reproduce. Every letter had to be carefully written by hand. Every mistake mattered. Every page demanded concentration. Most people would find this unbearable after a few days. Yet some monks devoted decades to it. Their work preserved countless ancient texts that would otherwise have disappeared forever. Of course, we cannot know what was happening inside their minds, but we can observe the behavior. the preference for routine, the comfort found in predictable schedules, the intense focus on specific interests, the willingness to spend extraordinary amounts of time mastering a narrow field of knowledge. These traits appear again and again within medieval monasteries. And the more we look, the more it becomes clear that some of history's greatest preservers of knowledge may have succeeded precisely because their minds worked a little differently from everyone else's. While monks preserved knowledge inside monastery walls, craftsmen preserved something equally important outside them: skill. And medieval craftsmanship often demanded a level of precision that bordered on obsession. Consider the cathedral builders. A massive cathedral was not constructed in a few years. Some took decades. Others took more than a century. Generations of workers contributed to projects they would never live to see completed. Imagine dedicating your entire career to a building whose grand opening would be attended by your great-grandchildren. Talk about delayed gratification. Yet thousands of craftsmen did exactly that. Stonecutters spent years carving blocks to exact specifications. Carpenters shaped beams with astonishing accuracy. Glaziers assembled intricate stained glass windows composed of hundreds of tiny pieces. Every task required attention to detail. Every mistake could be expensive. And every successful project rewarded patience. Many medieval trades naturally attracted people who enjoyed systems, patterns, and repetition. A blacksmith learned how different metals behaved under specific conditions. A weaver memorized countless thread combinations. A clockmaker, later in the medieval period, worked with intricate mechanisms that required extraordinary precision. These occupations rewarded intense focus. In fact, many master craftsmen became known for their perfectionism. Some developed reputations for inspecting their own work repeatedly before allowing it to leave the workshop. Others spent far longer on projects than customers expected because they refused to accept anything less than their personal standards. This could be frustrating for everyone involved. The customer wanted the item. The craftsman wanted it to be correct. History suggests the craftsman usually won. Medieval guild records occasionally mention apprentices who struggled because they lacked patience, discipline, or attention to detail. Yet they also reveal masters who devoted enormous energy to perfecting their craft. The difference between an ordinary sword and an exceptional one might come down to tiny details invisible to most people. The same was true for furniture, textiles, manuscripts, jewellery, and architecture. Many craftsmen noticed things that others simply did not. A slightly uneven line, a minor flaw in the metal, an irregular stitch, a measurement that was off by the width of a fingernail. To most people, these imperfections barely existed. To the craftsman, they were impossible to ignore. Again, none of this proves autism. Plenty of highly skilled people are not autistic. But when historians examine medieval society, certain patterns appear repeatedly. Individuals who thrive on routine, focus intensely on specific interests, notice details others miss, and willingly dedicate years to mastering a single skill. The workshop, much like the monastery, provided an environment where those traits could become strengths rather than obstacles. And in many cases, those strengths helped build the medieval world itself. One of the most common traits associated with autism today is a preference for routine. Not everyone experiences it in the same way, of course, but many autistic people find comfort in predictability. Knowing what comes next can make the world feel more manageable, less chaotic, and far easier to navigate. As it happens, medieval society was practically built on routine. This was not because medieval people had discovered some advanced psychological insight. It was because clocks were rare, life was difficult, and nobody wanted to accidentally starve. The average peasant's year followed a pattern that changed very little from one generation to the next. Crops were planted at specific times. Harvests occurred at specific times. Religious festivals followed the church calendar. Work began at sunrise and ended when daylight disappeared. Even the seasons dictated behaviour. Spring meant planting. Summer meant labour, autumn meant harvest, winter meant surviving, and then the entire process started again. Predictability was not merely comforting, it was essential. For someone who preferred structure, this environment may have felt surprisingly natural. A medieval farmer often performed the same tasks every day: feed the animals, check the fields, repair equipment, gather supplies, repeat. Tomorrow would look remarkably similar. So would next week, and probably next year. Even monasteries operated according to strict schedules. Bells announced prayers, meals, work periods, and rest. Monks could often predict exactly what they would be doing at any given hour. Frankly, some monasteries were so structured that modern corporate managers would probably take notes. This predictability helped maintain order in a world full of uncertainty, but it also meant that people who preferred routine did not necessarily stand out. Many behaviors that might seem unusual in a modern, fast-changing society blended naturally into medieval life. A person who insisted on performing tasks in the same order every day might simply be viewed as disciplined. Someone who became upset when routines changed could be seen as stubborn. Someone who carefully followed established customs might even earn respect. After all, medieval culture valued tradition. The phrase, "we've always done it this way," carried tremendous authority. Entire communities organized their lives around inherited habits. The downside, however, was that unexpected changes could be deeply disruptive. Wars, famines, plagues, and poor harvests could suddenly destroy the routines people depended upon. And for individuals who relied heavily on predictability, such disruptions may have been particularly difficult. Yet when life remained stable, medieval society offered something that many modern environments do not. A world where routine was not unusual. It was simply life. And for some people, that may have made the Middle Ages feel far less overwhelming than we often imagine. One challenge that many autistic people face today involves something most people never consciously think about: unwritten social rules. The strange thing about social rules is that nobody actually writes them down. There is no handbook, no official training course, no village elder standing in the town square announcing, "Good morning, everyone. Today's lesson is how long eye contact should last before things become uncomfortable." People are simply expected to know, and medieval society was absolutely overflowing with unwritten rules. In fact, medieval life may have contained even more social expectations than modern life. Every interaction had invisible layers. You had to know how to address a noble, how to greet a priest, how to behave at a feast, how much respect to show an elder, when to speak, when to remain silent, when to laugh, and perhaps most importantly, when not to laugh, particularly when the Lord was involved. The average peasant could probably survive a poor joke. Mocking the local lord was a considerably riskier experiment. These social customs were rarely explained in detail because most people learned them naturally through observation. Children spent years watching adults and gradually absorbed the expectations around them. But not everyone learns social behavior in exactly the same way. Medieval records occasionally describe individuals who seemed awkward, overly direct, or unaware of social conventions. Chroniclers often portrayed them as eccentric, strange, or lacking proper manners. Sometimes these descriptions sound remarkably familiar. A person speaks bluntly when diplomacy is expected. Someone becomes so focused on a topic that they continue discussing it long after everyone else has lost interest. Another individual misses subtle hints that seem obvious to others. None of these behaviors automatically indicate autism, but they do illustrate the kinds of social difficulties that have existed throughout human history. What's fascinating is that medieval society often tolerated these traits if the individual possessed valuable skills. A brilliant scholar might be forgiven for being socially awkward. A talented craftsman could be excused for being eccentric. A respected monk might be allowed certain peculiarities. People would simply shrug and say something equivalent to, "That's just how he is." Not exactly a clinical assessment, but surprisingly effective. Of course, this tolerance had limits. Someone who repeatedly violated important social expectations could find themselves isolated or criticized. The medieval world was not endlessly patient. Still, it recognized something that modern societies occasionally forget. Human beings are complicated. Some are charming, some are awkward, some effortlessly understand social situations. Others never quite figure them out. and those differences existed long before psychology gave them names. They were simply part of the rich, sometimes confusing, and often very human fabric of medieval life. If there was one medieval profession perfectly